I'm really thrilled today to be talking to Heather McDonald. You may have seen her recent appearance on the Rubin Report. Heather's had this long, impressive career as a writer and commentator. She's currently contributing editor to City Journal. She's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of a New York Times best-selling book, The War on Cops, and many other books and articles. She's a really brave, outspoken commentator. For instance, she takes on lies in the Black Lives Matter narrative when speaking out about criminal justice reform and race relations, immigration, and policing. But her new book is called The Gender Delusion: How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. Welcome, Heather. I'm delighted to have you here.
I'm honored, Bettina. Thank you so much.
I've been following your work for so long, watching videos wherever you appear, and I'm just struck by, how courageous, incisive, but also just brilliant at amassing data to demolish some of the nonsense being promoted about diversity and gender and race and so on. And I've been reading your new book for the last week. Absolutely incredibly impressed by that.
Thank you.
And it, of course, it absolutely covers all those issues in enormous detail, which is very exciting. But today what I want to do is focus on gender, primarily on gender and our universities, which are two areas where we've had remarkably similar experiences and I think similar concerns. Just briefly, facing a howling mob of protesters on a university campus. My regular viewers know that the riot squad had to be brought in to protect me last August at Sydney University when my audience was blocked from getting to the venue where I was supposed to be speaking. And I was speaking about the fake rape crisis. Now, you were at Claremont University. Tell me about that. You were supposed to be talking about racial issues, about why blacks want more policing.
Yeah, I was there to talk about my previous book, The War on Cops. I'd been invited by a government institute, and the message I was going to bring is that the Black Lives Matter narrative about policing is profoundly false. The data does not bear out the claim that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of Black men, and equally importantly, that there is a huge unrecognized vein of support for proactive policing in high crime minority neighborhoods. Well, those messages are simply not allowed on a college campus today. So a few days before I was scheduled to appear, there was a call out on Facebook to shut down the racist, fascist, homophobe, queerphobe, Islamophobe, you name it, white privilege bearer, a misogynist. We will not give the fascist Heather McDonald a platform to speak. And that was sort of what happened. I had to be escorted into the auditorium under police escort through a hidden passageway. The students had blockaded the auditorium so that nobody else could come into it to attend my talk. The university had set up a live streaming function, so I delivered my talk to an empty room while outside students were pounding on the plate glass windows and drumming. And eventually the cops shut down my talk, thinking they couldn't guarantee my safety any longer, and I was escorted out the kitchen into a waiting police van and driven off campus.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about, that's actually quite scary. I had the same thing, the pounding on the windows and the trying to drown you out. And what I was interested in was your reaction about these students having such confidence in their own rectitude. And that's something that struck me too.
Well, yeah, there's absolutely not a scintilla of doubt. And of course, we're in a situation now that for decades, adults have kowtowed to student protesters, having been protesters themselves once. There is an alliance between an ever-growing diversity bureaucracy and many faculty and these entitled, narcissistic, completely delusional students who are picking up on this narrative about ubiquitous racism and sexism being the predominant and unique characteristics of Western societies. And again, the academics that are promoting this idea themselves in their own scholarship. And so, yeah, the students, it is very much sort of like a cultural revolution
Yes.
type experience, and the professors are absolute cowards in if they have any disagreement with this, they nevertheless are completely hidden in the woodwork.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in my own case, I mean, as I said, what I was trying to do is draw attention to the lies being promoted on our campuses about this idea of a rape crisis, and particularly to expose where this is all heading, which is really in Australia about pushing our universities into following the US higher education system into getting involved in adjudicating rape cases. And you've done a wonderful job in the Diversity Delusion documenting how that happened in the US. And I'd really love you to explain how this all, where it all began and how this developed.
Well, we already had a lot of feminist activism in the 1980s, the Take Back the Night rallies, the clothesline projects, where people would post their alleged stories of sexual victimization on clotheslines, banging drums. But what really got this started was a study that was done by a University of Arizona professor that was a survey of college students that purported to show that a 1 in 4 sexual assault victimization rate among undergraduate females. Now, the way she got up this number, which is just astoundingly high, as we can discuss, was to commit an absolute violation of feminist dogma, which says always believe females. It turns out that when you ask female students themselves directly, have you been raped or sexually assaulted, you get a disappointingly low number.
Yep.
And so what Mary Koss did was instead break down her survey into discrete parts of what she thought, if you add it up back together again, would constitute rape. So she came up with this amazing number. However, 73% of the females whom she characterized as rape victims, when asked directly, said they had not been raped, and 42% went on to have sex again with their alleged rapist. Now, I submit to you, Bettina, that there is no more horrifying experience short of murder that a female can experience. The idea that any rape victim would voluntarily go and have sex again with her rapist is simply preposterous. This should have been a tip-off that there was something deeply flawed about this study, but of course it was wildly enthusiastically received and became the basis not just for campus policy, but for federal policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it included hugely expanded definition of what we call rape in order to get those statistics.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned in the book, this data, this analysis has been thoroughly discredited. I think there was a Harvard examination of that, how those figures came about and what the truth was there. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, no, I think you're referring to the American Association of Universities sponsored various sex surveys on college campuses, and Harvard was one of the colleges that participated. The AAU and Harvard believed that their data absolutely confirmed a rape crisis, but it showed something that has also shown up again and again on these surveys, that the vast majority of respondents whom the researchers characterized as rape victims do not report their alleged rapes to the authorities. And when asked why they don't report, the overwhelming reason why they don't report, this is 2/3 to 70% to 75%, is that they don't think that what happened to them was serious enough to report. Again, let's remember what rape is. Nobody would think it's not serious enough.
Yeah,
and
right.
and let's just look again at what these numbers mean. 20 to 25% rape incidents, that exceeds any crime wave in any known society. You can go to the worst African civil wars where the soldiers use rape as an instrument of war. I don't know of anybody that would claim a 20 to 25% rape incidence. Detroit is the United States' most violent city. When you combine all 4 of the FBI's so-called index felonies, that's rape, murder, aggravated assault, which is mostly shootings, and robbery, armed robbery, for all four, you get a 2% rate in a year. The rape incidence is like 0.05%. So this is simply preposterous. If this were going on, if this were going on, and we really believe that females are strong women together, there would have been a stampede away from college campuses into single-sex schools. Mothers would have demanded a safe environment for their daughters. None of that has happened because this whole thing is bogus.
Bogus. I mean, I love your comment about in New York, you know, mothers spend a fortune even tutoring their preschoolers, their little tiny kids, to try to get them into the right kindergarten to go through, hopefully lead into an Ivy college eventually. And what we, you know, the notion that they would be doing that if the university is really unsafe, we're crawling with rapists, is just ludicrous.
Well, you know, the State Department, if this was a country that had a 20 to 25% rape rate for females, the State Department would put out an advisory saying, do not go to that country. Tourism would disappear. Instead, the frenzy to get into selective colleges each year grows more and more intense. Harvard is down to like a 5% admissions rate, driven at least 50% by females trying to get in.
I just want to tell my viewers who aren't up to date on all of this, how the figures compare to Australia. We had similar figures being thrown around suggesting, you know, 73% of women have been sexually assaulted and so on, which were questioned, of course. But then the activists here persuaded the Human Rights Commission to spend $1 million on a survey that found 0.8% of students reported any sort of sexual assault, and that included being touched by a stranger on the train to uni or a bus or whatever. And as you say, Heather, 40% of those women who claimed this sort of sexual assault, using this really broad definition, 40% said they didn't need help. 40% said it wasn't serious enough to report. So even within that tiny number who reported any sort of sexual assault, most of them didn't regard as what most of us would think of as rape. And yet that data was released in Australia, around the country. All the media lied about it. They fudged the data to talk about high levels of sexual violence and included figures on sexual harassment, where the majority of women had reported some degree of very low-grade sexual harassment, like unwanted staring. And we had this lie perpetuated around the country, including from our universities, who then stepped in, as they did in America, and started setting up all these rape crisis units and you know, 24-hour helplines for rape victims. I loved your comment, Heather, about the loneliest, the most boring job on a university campus is running a rape crisis center because no one comes.
Yeah, this is the rape bureaucrats' despair, because they've got all this propaganda out there and students are not reporting. But nevertheless, this is one of the areas of just metastasizing bureaucracy, the victim bureaucracy on at least American college campuses. And I doubt whether you're free of this, unfortunately, in Australia, that is just devoted to every different species of victimhood. I'm amazed that you had that low a reporting rate and the researchers were unable to massage it. That shows that there's a little bit more connection to reality in Australia.
Well, no, they buried it. You know, it's there in the data. I was the only journalist in Australia to write an article saying, let's celebrate our safe campuses. And every other media, you know, source in Australia promoted this idea that there's an alarming level of violence on our campuses. They did their best to misrepresent that data. But I want to go back, Heather, to talk about what happened next in the States. So then came the Obama Dear College letter. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, colleges had already been running these campus rape tribunals that were an absolute travesty, a rejection of the hard-won understanding of due process and fair adjudication that the Anglo-American tradition has built up over centuries. But the Obama administration sort of wrote those lousy, phony processes into law by telling colleges across the country that if they hadn't already junked such basic guarantees of fairness as allowing a defendant to cross-examine his accuser, they better do it now or face a lawsuit, face possible loss of federal funding. The Obama administration also demanded that colleges use the lowest possible standard for determining guilt and innocence, something called the preponderance of evidence standard, which only requires 50.5% certainty that the event alleged has happened. Now, if you're doing maybe student plagiarism, that's an okay standard, but for something like rape, which now has been obviously turned into well, rape is very serious were it to be real, but what we're seeing now on college campuses is not rape. Nevertheless, if a student is thrown out of a school under one of these phony rape accusations, his career is over. So colleges made sure that they, were involved in this massive betrayal of the protections for fairness in any kind of tribunal, and things just got worse and worse from there.
Tell us about some of the horrible cases. I mean, I suppose the Rolling Stone one is the classic, is it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the Rolling Stone one just really instead reveals the appetite, the famished hunger on the part of the media elites to believe the worst about campus college men. This was a complete hoax. The Rolling Stone reporter fell for a story that was so patently absurd that these fraternity boys had used broken glass to violate a female that they put her. But as far as I'm concerned, that's sort of the less interesting story. The more interesting story are some of the actual rape cases that have been brought that have resulted in males getting thrown out of schools. Things like at Occidental, where you had a female engaged in a whole series of text messages with her partner for the evening, planning to have college sex, bedroom sex, planning how to elude the bystanders that had noticed that this girl had drunk herself completely blotto, that nobody, crammed open her jaws like an alligator and poured alcohol down her throat. This was completely on her own volition, but she continued to send texts to the guy saying, "We're having sex," asking him, "Do you have a condom?" And he said yes, and she said, "Okay, great, I'll be down." She texted a friend saying, "I'm going to have sex now," and she showed up in his bedroom, and sure enough, they had sex. Now, again, I submit to you, Bettina, any boy who gets a text from a female saying, "Do you have a condom?" and arranging a tryst is going to assume consent, rightly so, and there was consent. Nevertheless, a few days later, when she saw that he was unaffected emotionally by their encounter, whereas she lost her virginity, something that, contrary to the nostrums of sexual liberation, which say that sex is just any activity like washing your socks or something, it is for females, whether it's losing your virginity or any other type of coitus, far more emotionally compelling, has different hormonal response. So she saw this guy just kind of going to classes and, hey, great, one night stand. This is precisely what the guys are looking for in this era of sexual liberation and drunken hookups. She then was influenced by the campus sexual assault bureaucracy to recharacterize her experience as rape, and he was thrown out. He's suing Occidental. That case has not yet reached a conclusion, but clearly the campus had been taken over by a group of completely left-wing women's studies professors who had announced that this guy fit the very definition of a campus rapist because he came from a good family, he was white, He had good grades, and I think he belonged to some sort of organization on campus. So this was a political witch hunt, and these are typical. These are happening all across the country.
And a lot of these families are now suing the universities and winning. I mean, there's a very good book called The Campus Rape Frenzy, came out a few years ago, documenting a lot of these cases and showing the majority of cases the universities are found not to protect the due process rights of these young men. Can you tell us about, so we've got Trump administration coming in and making some attempt to wind back the excesses of the failure of the colleges to protect the rights of the accused?
Well, the Betsy DeVos, our education secretary, has withdrawn this so-called guidance letter that the Obama administration put out requiring that the schools junk cross-examination and use the preponderance of evidence standard. And she's now actually following the normal rulemaking processes. She's following the normal legal procedures for regulating campuses, unlike the Obama administration. So she submitted a proposed regulation that would minimally strengthen the due process protections, even though it was couched in all of the nauseating maudlin rhetoric of survivors, believing survivors, and the trauma of campus rape. Nevertheless, because she has dared to suggest that there should be fairness for both parties, this regulation is just, there's a pylon from universities across the campus saying we're not going to do this. This would be so unfair to survivors. So if she goes through with the regulation anyway, there'll be a massive revolt, and I frankly don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference. I disagree with some people who put all of the onus for this travesty of due process on the Obama administration. I think the Obama administration was a little bubble on the tidal wave of anti-male animus that was already well underway on these campuses. This is not a regulatory problem, it's an ideological problem, and no amount of top-down regulation is going to solve this unless more people are willing to stand up and say, we are not living in a patriarchal society. Campuses are the most tolerant, free environments in human history, not just for females, but for so-called students of color. This thing has to be fought on an ideological basis, not a legal one.
I totally agree with you. But I just wanted to explain to people who don't watch my videos regularly that we are, in Australia, we're just beginning to move into that effort to get the universities involved in regulating rape cases. University of Sydney late last year introduced new legislation to adjudicate rape cases on a lower standard of proof, very similar to the sort of thing Heather's been talking about. I spent 8 months last year helping a University of Adelaide PhD student who's being investigated by a university committee. This is happening in Australia already, and it is aimed at getting more rape convictions of young men using lower standards of proof and failing to provide them with the normal legal protections. And we have to speak out about that. But I totally agree with you that it's part of a much bigger push within the universities. So one of the things that you mentioned in relation to the Occidental College, the issue of this drunken hookup business and the role of alcohol in fueling sexual incidents, which often end up for the woman as something she regrets. And that's something that's always intrigued me because we've got in Australia these sexual consent courses, which are becoming compulsory. Students have to do these courses, online courses. One university just late last year just announced they were withholding exam results of students who don't complete those courses. Now, those courses teach young women that they can drink as much as they like, and it's always, the minute they have anything to drink, it's the male responsibility, and he's raping her because she cannot consent if she's drinking. The involvement of alcohol in all of this is critical to me, and it's never addressed.
Well, it sort of is. I mean, you have bystander intervention and whatnot. For me, what's more interesting, obviously, the role of alcohol is huge. And as I say, Bettina, you have girls who are deliberately drinking themselves to a state in order to lower their sexual inhibitions.
Yeah.
So yeah, if I presume that if everybody was sober, this would be almost non-existent, although I don't know. But for me, what's more interesting is whether it's an online consent course or 40 pages of sexual consent rules that look like something would be drafted for signing a mortgage or buying a used car from some
Yeah.
shyster. And the idea that we have now bureaucrats in the business of writing highly technical rules for sex is just so bizarre. And I think that conservatives who are appalled by the due process violations miss that fact. They
Yeah.
focus on, well, let's have more regulations in the tribunals, but let's step back and remind ourselves how this all began. This began with the sexual liberation, with college students in the 1960s complaining about so-called parietal oversight of college administrators, the in loco parentis rules that said, well, you can't have a male and a female in the same dorm room. You either have to have the door open or 1 foot on the floor. And, basically this can't happen, in a rather realistic acknowledgement of what adolescent libidos, especially male libidos, look like. And so in the 1960s and the 1970s, students said, whoa, get out of our bedrooms. We want to have all the sex we want. And this was part of the whole sexual liberation. And so you had all of those rules junked. So students are now free to have coitus as much as they want. And it turns out, however, that sexual liberation is far more beneficial for males than females. And what I think is going on college campuses today is sexual liberation is having a nervous breakdown. You have the feminists wanting to have it all sorts of ways. On the one hand, they're determined to protect the right of maximal promiscuity of girls. On the other hand, they are rapidly reimporting a whole set of Victorian social norms that does make, as you say, Bettina, the male the unique guardian and protector of female safety and virtue, treats the female as basically helpless. And so if both parties are equally drunk and equally unable to make completely rational decisions, the only person who is viewed as responsible for that situation is the male. The female, by and large, is held completely harmless because she's a fainting female and needs the male to protect her. So it's just extraordinarily bizarre, these rules. And you have students who once were saying to adults, leave us alone, actively encouraging these sorts of weird rules about conduct that you regard as unwelcome constitutes sexual assault.
Yeah.
Sex is the very realm of the chthonic. It's the realm of the irrational, of inhibition, of embarrassment, of envy, desire, lust. And if you don't understand that, read Ovid's Metamorphoses or the Decathlon,
Yeah.
literature that understands the primal forces that we're trying now to regulate with some sort of widget contractual signing consent form.
Heather, I was really interested in the way you write about these complexities of, of sexuality, and the fact that, there are real differences in the way, particularly young men and women, respond to a sexual encounter. And women are much more likely to be upset if it doesn't lead on to anything. I think there's a lot more emotional investment very often for young women. And so you end up with regret sex. You end up with women having sex thinking it was going to lead on to something wonderful. And when he sees it as the most pleasurable, but just a hookup,
Right.
that's very upsetting to her. And that's where that plays into this whole narrative, victim narrative, because she then feels badly done by, and she has this weaponry
Yep.
to take him on, to punish him for his indifference. And we see this played out again and again, and it's so worrying for me looking at what's happening to the young men in this circumstance.
Right. And, we have a Title IX consultant, again, one of these guys who travels the country, raking in huge consulting fees by riding this wave of campus rape phony allegations. But Brett Sokolow, he actually has written a few critical and skeptical accounts of what he sees is going on. Even he recognizes these completely phony allegations, and he reports a bunch of them that his firm was brought in to adjudicate, where the females admit that they were having sex with a friend of their boyfriend and
Yeah,
don't want the boyfriend to know, and bring rape charges.
yeah,
Or again, one girl says, well, I put it out there on social media that we were having rape, but that's what we call it when it's drunken sex. It was rapey rape. We all know that rapey rape is not really rape. So
yeah,
this is not you and me, Bettina, making these skeptical allegations. These are the students themselves who acknowledge that these rape allegations grow out a whole number of different allegations. Sometimes, in fact, the sense of being betrayed or not having an equal emotional response. Other times, just sheer jealousy when they've broken up and the male takes up with another girl. Other times, wanting to cover up one's tracks. But also there's a whole sort of genre out there, including by the New York Times's first gender editor, which is preposterous that our New York Times now thinks that gender is such an important topic that it needs an entire news desk devoted to it. But she wrote an article, an op-ed, about how she had sex when she was 19 with a guy simply because it was too fatiguing to say no. And
yeah, yeah,
what I've mentioned, discussed the fact that what's gone on is we have moved the default for premarital sex from no to yes. In the pre-sexual liberation era, the default was no, and females had the right and option to opt out of that no default and have yes to premarital sex, but it meant that you didn't have to negotiate a no each time. Sexual liberation turned that on its head. The default for premarital sex is now yes, and it means that females have to negotiate a no. And this Jessica Barnett has written an article about it's just too exhausting. I quote people that on various feminist websites that say, yeah, well, it was just sometimes you have lunch with girls you don't want to have lunch with, and sometimes you have sex with guys you don't want to have sex with, just
yeah,
because it gets too hard to argue. They're actually not claiming this is sexual assault, which I guess we should be grateful for, but this whole category of gray rape is now some of the Title IX coordinators on campus are saying, oh no, that is rape.
absolutely.
It's
I mean,
ridiculous.
I must say, I should have acknowledged some responsibility, because I was very much part of that push towards sexual liberation in my youth. As one of Australia's first,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, first sex therapists, and I got involved in sex therapy to help women learn to enjoy their sexuality more. And that was my goal. So I was very much part of when I think we were at university at very similar times, Heather, because I was part of that push to, celebrating the fact that we had the pill, we had contraception, women could look after themselves sexually and but it was, in my view, about taking responsibility for our sexuality, making decisions on our own part instead of someone controlling the way we behaved. And this turnabout to once again go back to putting men in charge is the most extraordinary thing to me. And I suppose what my lesson over the years has been, I suppose we didn't anticipate the complexities for women and the struggle they would have in owning their own behavior and taking responsibility for that, and saying, I got drunk because I didn't want to make a decision about whether I want to go to bed with this man, and I have to live with that. Or I had sex with him and I really didn't want my boyfriend to know, all the things you've been talking about. Women are now unable to act as responsible adults, and that's what I was hoping they would do, but it's just not happened, as you said. And we now have this army of officials in our universities getting involved in trying to orchestrate this complex behavior, and it's just madness.
Well, there's two issues there. There's one, the issue of the narrative that teaches females to think of themselves as victims and to blame anything that happens on them on the patriarchy. And so the responsibility going back to the males. But the other gets to your initial crusade and whether that could have continued uh, with on a better course
Yeah,
without it devolving into this kind of neo-Victorianism and victimhood. And I guess I would be a little more skeptical about whether that was really the best path to set us out on, just because I do think that there are big differences between the male and female libidos. And when you, the assumption now that we've changed the default for premarital sex from no to yes, is that you can put the male and the female added on a tourniquet, a tournament field, and they go mano and mano, and they're equally matched. They're simply not.
no,
And the male libido is the one who's really benefited the most from this new regime, because males do want to have sex with as many females as possible with as little consequences. Biologically, evolutionarily, that makes sense for them. It doesn't make sense for females given their very different fertility cycles and what's at
yeah,
stake in
yeah,
procreation for females. So I guess I think that culture had some understandings that were worked into literature, that were worked into social norms, that I think we jettisoned with a little too much alacrity and disregard for what might come out of it. But it was an experiment, I suppose, worth going through. But we see it now in a very sub rosa way being walked back in a way that is still remain maximally unfair to males. Now, I get questions from parents saying, well, I'm so worried that my son is going to become the victim of a false rape accusation. And I'm not particularly sympathetic to the males either, because just as females can avoid 100% what is characterized as campus rape by acting responsibly, by not getting drunk, by not getting into bed with a guy you don't really know, by not taking off your clothes and starting a whole set of activities that are hard to walk back. A guy just as easily can avoid almost entirely. Now there's some really extreme cases, himself becoming the victim of a phony campus rape accusation by walking his girlfriend home at night, kissing her goodbye, seeing her off to her own bedroom, and going back to his own, and writing her a love poem at 2 a.m. rather than engaging in the campus bacchanal.
Yes and no. I mean, I can see that argument, but I mean, these are young adults,
Well,
often at university for the prime period of their early adulthood. To say you just end it's always kept to just a kiss, I think that's a bit unrealistic. And
do you think it did never happen? Do you
well,
think?
of course it does happen. It happens, but I'm saying this can be a really committed relationship of young people getting involved together, having starting off in an absolutely committed romantic relationship. And then when it breaks up, he can still be charged with sexual assault if she chooses. I mean, it isn't just drunken hookups we're talking about here. And in fact, some of the cases I know about, they have been in a relationship where she then gets angry at the fact that he chooses to end it. Right. I don't think that's necessary. I mean, obviously, no sex is some sort of protection, although there are allegations where I suspect there weren't even sex never even took place.
Probably.
You look at the Me Too movement, where angry women who are annoyed with a boss 30 years ago, who took fault with their work, the way they worked, or whatever it is, can absolutely make up allegations and be believed. I mean, I worry that it's no protection to just be well behaved as a young man.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. It is just simply amazing. You have a guy, people being fired from literary editor positions for patting a, friend on the butt in the kitchen. again, we're in this very weird situation of maximal promiscuity, and then this sort of neo-Puritanism where females are pretending to go into absolute meltdown at any manifestation of interest or desire. Now, obviously, neither of us are coming anywhere close to justifying actual quid pro quo harassment or any use of coercive force, but the fact of the matter is that eros is everywhere.
Yeah.
And any in a lot of workplaces it's there, and it should be restrained to the great extent possible. But males are going to be testing for interest. That's what they do. And I wish that there could be some kind of Lysistrata sex strike on males' parts to absolutely show no interest in females, and we'll see how females respond to that. Because you have right now a 100 gazillion trillion dollar industry devoted to cultivating females' desire to be as sexy a sex object as possible, whether it's makeup or breast implants or lip implants or butt implants or stiletto heels or push-up bras, you name it. I mean, the idea that it is simply the male gaze which is pushing females into these roles of trying to be sexually alluring is just complete feminist propaganda. It's a two-way street. Females are playing this game as much as males, but only the males are now suffering from it.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to broader issues regarding our universities and the gender discrimination taking place there, the ideological claptrap being taught in our universities, teaching young women that they're victims and systematically discriminating against men. And you've written a lot of wonderful material in the book about that. Can you explain?
Well, let me state first sort of the principles of what I call the diversity delusion. It's race and gender are the most important things about any individual, something which I think is ridiculous. I do not find being female particularly interesting. I do not view it as an accomplishment. Proposition B, discrimination based on race and gender is the defining characteristic of American society and the West in general. And C, any disproportion, any lack of proportional representation in any institution, whether it's 50-50 female to male representation or when it comes to minorities, any proportional representation of minorities in an institution is by definition a result of racism or sexism. So when we look at the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, the so-called STEM fields, we see that in certain very hard sciences, whether it's math, physics, computer engineering, or even economics, there is not 50-50 female to male representation. It's more like 20-25% female, 75% male. So according to the three tenets of the diversity delusion, this must be by definition, no questions asked, a result of gender discrimination. And we have now the federal government spending billions of taxpayer dollars on studies of intersectionality and microaggressions in STEM, and every STEM field in department in the country is putting its professors through implicit bias training. Well, I've started collecting these natural experiments that test whether a lack of 50-50 gender representation in an institution must be by definition a result of sexism. It turns out there are many institutions out there with no gatekeepers whatsoever. So you can't say these are sexist gatekeepers keeping females out. One of the most interesting ones is the online encyclopedia Wikipedia. I don't know if you've got it on Australia. I presume so. Right. So Wikipedia is open to all comers. Anybody can write an entry. Anybody can edit an entry. It's blind. It's anonymous. It turns out that only 13% of Wikipedia editors and writers are females. Again, there are no gatekeepers. Nobody is keeping females from writing. It turns out that males naturally are more interested in these fact-based realms of competition, of getting things right. We've seen this already. You know, people like Susan Estridge, one of our professional feminists in the United States, has complained about the fact that our op-ed pages, our opinion pages in newspapers are not, or were not, before the massive introduction of gender quotas, 50-50 female to male writers. Well, it turns out that who's submitting op-ed submissions, males at about 2/3 to 1/3 females. Same for letters to the editor. Other gatekeeper free institutions that I've looked at, the Scrabble international championships have never had a female winner. Now, females actually make up the majority of amateur Scrabble players, but it turns out that that obsessiveness, that passion to compete and dominate is a male trait.
Yeah.
And it's what gives us computer nerds that are sitting there at 2 a.m. coding in a freezing computer lab eating cold crusts of pizza. Females on average don't do that. Other natural experiments, the geography bees, history bees, uh, they you can go down the list. It's never ending. Excuse me. So this idea that only discrimination rather than aptitudes and preferences explain the lack of gender proportionality is complete bunk.
Heather, one of the things that I thought was extraordinary in the diversity delusion is the evidence you've pulled together about university administration and this army of gender officers working so hard to promote their ideology. And of course, they have a vested interest in keeping this all alive. I thought it was really scary.
Well, there's a mutual codependency between narcissistic, delusional students and these diversity bureaucrats. Students regularly act out little psychodramas of oppression before an appreciative audience of diversity deanlets and vice chancellors of equity and inclusion who use the occasion to expand their dominion. Our tuitions in college tuitions in the United States, I don't know about Australia, are just obscene. You know, for private schools, you're looking at $60,000, $70,000 a year. Public universities can be 20, 24,000. And the reason overwhelmingly is the expanding student services bureaucracy, which is made up in increasing numbers by these bureaucrats who are occupying complete sinecures. They have nothing to do because there is not a shred, a scintilla of sexism or racism on college campuses. The faculty are the most tolerant individuals in human history towards society's traditionally oppressed and marginalized groups. They want all of their students to succeed. And yet you have this whole cadre paid sometimes enormous amounts. The University of California, Los Angeles, a public university, taxpayer supported, pays its vice chancellor for equity, diversity, and inclusion over $400,000 a year to do nothing.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was so envious of you having all that data, and I'm going to put a call out to people in our universities. If you know anybody who could get me this sort of similar information about Australia, please contact me, because I would love to make this public. How much are our Australian universities spending on this rubbish? I think we better sort of wind this up, Heather. I've been very grateful to you for explaining these issues which are so relevant to Australia as well. And I hope people will seek out your book, The Diversity Delusion. They would have an enormous amount to learn from having a good look at that. And I hope maybe we can I'd love to have a talk to you in the future about some of the other areas where you have such expertise, policing and criminal law and so on. There are parallel issues in Australia in the way we discuss issues like race in relation to our Indigenous community. And I think a lot of people would be very interested in hearing about that as well. But thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Bettina. And I hope you can fend off the madness before it gets a lot worse in Australia, because I can tell you it is destroying civil peace in the United States.
Absolutely. And we all need to stand up and fight it.
Right.
And you know, I
Tell the
really
truth.
welcome your outspokenness and courage in doing so.
Thank you.